When I first began studying the lesser-known aircraft of the Second World War, one project always stood out to me, a machine that seemed to come straight from the pages of science fiction. The DFS 228, a reconnaissance aircraft built quite literally out of wood and intended to fly higher than any other plane of its time. It was Germany's desperate attempt to see the enemy from the stratosphere, and it almost defied the laws of physics. By the early 1940s, the Luftwaffe was facing a growing problem. Allied bombers were attacking deeper and deeper into the Reich, and accurate reconnaissance was becoming nearly impossible. German spy planes like the Ju-86P had reached their limits. They could climb to around 12,000 meters, but the Allies were quickly developing fighters and radar capable of reaching them. The German High Command wanted something radical, an aircraft that could operate above 20,000 meters, completely beyond the reach of any interception. It had to be light, efficient, and capable of gliding silently over enemy territory. In short, they needed a spy plane that could reach the edge of space and return alive. That was the impossible challenge handed to the engineers of the DFS, the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, or the German Research Institute for Gliding. The team at the DFS knew they were being asked to do the impossible. In 1943, as Allied bombers thundered across German skies and the Reich's industrial heart was burning, the DFS engineers worked quietly in a corner of occupied Europe, not on a weapon, but on a vision. They dreamed of a plane that could soar above it all, gliding so high that the world below would fade into a blue haze. Their solution began with what they knew best: gliders. The DFS had already designed record-breaking sailplanes, masters of efficiency and lightness. So they started with a sleek, narrow fuselage, long wings with elegant tapering, and a cockpit built for a single pilot. The structure, however, would be unconventional: wood. Aluminum and steel were increasingly reserved for fighters like the Bf-109 and Me-262. Wood was cheap, light, and, if treated properly, could withstand enormous aerodynamic forces. The concept evolved quickly: a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft powered by a rocket engine during ascent, then gliding silently back to base. But there was another radical twist. The pilot's compartment would be pressurized, sealed like a capsule, allowing him to survive near-space conditions. No German aircraft had ever attempted such a thing before. To make it even more futuristic, they designed the entire nose section to detach, functioning as an escape pod in case of emergencies. On paper, it was brilliant, a wooden bird with the soul of a rocket. In practice, it would test every limit of wartime technology. From the outside, the DFS 228 didn't look like a machine of war. It looked almost delicate, a long, slender glider with smooth, graceful lines. Yet behind that elegant wooden shell hid one of the most advanced concepts ever attempted in aviation up to that point. Every curve, every piece of its frame was crafted with obsessive precision. The engineers knew that weight was their greatest enemy. Every extra kilogram meant a lower ceiling, a shorter glide, and one more reason for failure. The use of wood wasn't just a necessity born from shortages. It was also a technical decision. Wood absorbed vibrations differently from metal and was easier to shape into the aerodynamic forms required for high-altitude efficiency. But it came with terrifying weaknesses. Temperature changes at extreme altitudes could make the glue brittle, while condensation could creep between the joints, warping the structure. Still, the DFS team believed in their dream. They coated the surface with special sealants, reinforced critical sections with thin layers of metal, and built test pieces to simulate the freezing vacuum of high-altitude flight. The prototype wings stretched wide, built for maximum lift in thin air, and the cockpit, that strange, egg-shaped capsule, looked more like something from a future space program than a 1940s airplane. Every engineer knew this was a gamble. A plane made of wood and glue was never meant to fly to the edge of the stratosphere, and yet that was precisely what they were trying to achieve. If the wooden frame gave the DFS 228 its body, then the Walter HWK 509 rocket engine was its heart. Volatile, temperamental, and utterly unforgiving. This was the same basic power plant used in the Mi-163 Comet, the world's first rocket-powered fighter. But while the Comet was designed to climb and strike with terrifying speed, the DFS 228 would use that same fury only to ascend, then shut it off and glide silently like a ghost. The engine burned a mixture of hydrogen peroxide and hydrazine hydrate, a combination so reactive that fueling it was a life-or-death task. Ground crews wore rubber suits and gas masks. One mistake could dissolve flesh. Yet this power source was the only way to push a manned aircraft above 20,000 meters. Turbojets of the era simply couldn't breathe that thin air. The plan was simple in theory. The DFS 228 would be towed aloft by a Dornier-Do 217 to save fuel, released at altitude, ignite its rocket, and then climb into the stratosphere. Once the photographic mission was complete, the pilot would shut down the motor, transform the craft back into a glider, and slip home under radar coverage. On paper, it was an elegant marriage of violence and grace, raw rocket power tempered by the serenity of soaring flight. But the reality of testing such a machine would soon prove far more dangerous than the blueprints ever hinted. Of all the innovations behind the DFS 228, none captured my imagination quite like the pilot's capsule. Imagine sitting in a wooden rocket glider alone, 30,000 feet above the Earth, a fragile bubble separating you from the freezing void. That's what the engineers at the DFS were building toward, a one-man spacecraft before the word even existed. The cockpit was a pressurized chamber, something rare and extremely advanced for its time. German scientists understood that the thin air of the upper stratosphere could kill a man in seconds, not from lack of oxygen alone, but from decompression sickness and cold. So they designed the nose section of the aircraft as a self-contained life support capsule. It would maintain stable pressure, provide oxygen, and protect the pilot from temperatures that could plunge below 60 degrees. But there was more. In case of disaster, a fire, a loss of control, or a catastrophic engine failure, the entire nose could detach from the aircraft. Small parachutes would slow its fall, and the pilot could then eject himself safely with another chute. It was an early concept of an escape pod, something that wouldn't become standard in aviation until decades later. The men selected for these test flights were not ordinary pilots. They were glider masters, men who understood the silence and sensitivity of flight without power. Brave, disciplined, and perhaps a little mad, because only a madman would agree to fly a wooden rocket into the stratosphere. The first tests of the DFS 228 began quietly in 1944, far from the chaos of the front lines. The Allies were bombing German cities daily, yet in a secluded airfield, a handful of engineers and test pilots were preparing something extraordinary. They started small, with gliding tests only. A Dornier-Do 217 bomber would tow the sleek wooden prototype into the sky, release it, and let the pilot feel how the aircraft handled. Those early flights were crucial. Without the rocket engine, the DFS 228 behaved beautifully. Its long wings gave it a graceful, efficient glide, and pilots reported a sense of serenity unlike anything they had flown before. But serenity can be deceptive. When the engineers simulated rocket-powered climbs, the glider's delicate frame began to reveal its weaknesses. The fuselage flexed more than expected, and the wooden panels creaked under stress. To gather data, they equipped the prototype with special sensors that measured pressure and temperature changes. The results were troubling. Even during moderate climbs, the cockpit seals leaked, and frost began forming around the edges of the canopy. If it failed completely at altitude, the pilot wouldn't even have time to realize what had happened. His blood would boil in seconds. Despite these dangers, the team pressed on. They believed the concept was too important to abandon. Germany's future in the air, they argued, depended on high-altitude reconnaissance. But the war was turning against them, and time was running out fast. By late 1944, the DFS team was ready to attempt the unthinkable, to ignite a rocket engine inside a wooden airframe. It sounds insane even today, but desperation had stripped away hesitation. The Luftwaffe wanted results, and the engineers needed proof that their strange creation could survive powered flight. The chosen prototype was fitted with a modified Walter HWK 509 engine, the same volatile beast that powered the Me-163 Comet. The preparations were nerve-wracking. Every bolt, every hose, every drop of fuel had to be perfect. Hydrogen peroxide and hydrazine were both incredibly corrosive. They could eat through seals, burn skin, or detonate if handled carelessly. When the technicians began fueling, they stood behind blast shields, knowing a single leak could erase the entire project in a flash of white fire. The first ground ignition was both spectacular and terrifying. The engine roared to life, belching blue flames beneath the wooden fuselage. Heat waves rippled along the smooth skin of the aircraft. Sensors showed dangerous temperature spikes around the mounting points. Miraculously, the frame held, but the test made one thing clear: the DFS 228 could never sustain long rocket burns. The structure would eventually char, deform, and fail. Still, the test proved one crucial point: the wooden glider could survive brief rocket-powered ascents. That small victory was enough to justify continuing. In wartime Germany, failure wasn't an option. It was a luxury they no longer had. The dream of flight above the stratosphere flickered on, fragile but alive. As 1945 dawned, the war was collapsing around Germany. Allied armies were closing in from both east and west. Cities were in ruins, and yet, in a quiet corner of Bavaria, a handful of engineers still worked feverishly on their wooden dream. The DFS 228 project had become more than a military experiment. It was a symbol of what German science could still achieve under impossible conditions. But time, that invisible enemy, was running out faster than fuel or manpower. Supplies grew scarce. Each test required materials that were now almost impossible to find: high-grade glue, treated plywood, and precision instruments. Skilled workers were being drafted into combat, and factories that once built aircraft were reduced to rubble. Even finding enough hydrogen peroxide for the rocket engine became a logistical nightmare. The engineers often joked darkly that their plane might be finished only after the war was lost. Yet they persisted. They refined the aerodynamics, improved the seals on the pressurized cockpit, and dreamed of a powered flight that would prove the concept once and for all. They knew that if they could just get one successful mission, one flight above 20,000 meters, it might change the Luftwaffe's entire reconnaissance strategy. But as Allied, bombers roared overhead and fuel deliveries vanished. The DFS 228 was grounded more often than not. The skies that once inspired its creation were now dominated by enemies. The project had become a race not against altitude, but against extinction. In the spring of 1945, with Germany's defeat all but certain, the DFS 228 finally touched the sky under its own power. The date was never officially recorded. Secrecy still mattered, but witnesses later described it as a grey morning, cold and silent, when a strange wooden glider was rolled onto the airfield for what everyone knew could be its first and last flight. The pilot, a veteran glider expert whose name has since been lost to history, climbed into the cramped capsule and sealed the canopy. He was calm, perhaps resigned. Around him, the ground crew made final checks: oxygen pressure, fuel lines, parachutes. Then, as the tow plane began its long takeoff run, the DFS 228 followed, light as a feather, its long wings flexing under the strain. At altitude, the tow cable released. For a moment there was silence, and then the pilot pressed the ignition switch. A flash of white light erupted behind him, and the rocket engine screamed to life. The aircraft surged upward, slicing through the thin air faster than any glider ever had. The wooden frame creaked, the cockpit temperature rose, but it held. Instruments climbed past 15,000 meters, perhaps higher, and then the engine shut down. The pilot glided the plane back toward the clouds, descending silently over a dying nation. He landed safely, exhausted, trembling, but alive. That short flight proved that the DFS 228 could work. But by then, it no longer mattered. Germany had only weeks left before surrender. Just weeks after the first and only powered flight of the DFS 228, the war in Europe came to an abrupt end. German cities lay in ruins, the Luftwaffe was shattered, and the engineers who had risked their lives for this wooden dream faced an uncertain future. The DFS 228, once a symbol of daring innovation, was now little more than debris and unfinished prototypes scattered across abandoned airfields. Allied forces discovered some of the prototypes and test equipment, quickly realizing that this strange aircraft had been designed to push the limits of high-altitude reconnaissance. The surviving engineers were interrogated, their research confiscated. Many of the design principles, pressurized cockpits, detachable nose capsules, and lightweight glider structures, would eventually influence post-war aviation in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet, for all its promise, the DFS 228 never fulfilled its mission. It never gathered intelligence over enemy territory, never flew in combat, and never became operational. Its success existed only in fleeting tests, in the imagination of its creators, and in the awe of those who witnessed its silent glide. The dream of a wooden rocket plane had been beautiful, fragile, and ultimately doomed, a testament to both ingenuity and desperation in wartime Germany. Looking back, the DFS 228 stands as one of the most fascinating what-ifs of aviation history. Its design combined principles that were decades ahead of their time. Lightweight wooden structures, pressurized capsules, detachable escape sections, and rocket propulsion for short bursts. Yet in the chaos of war, such brilliance was fragile. Prototypes were destroyed, documents were lost, and much of the technical knowledge vanished almost overnight. What remains, however, is a testament to the ingenuity and courage of its engineers. Every curve of the wooden fuselage, every carefully calculated angle of its wings shows a meticulous understanding of aerodynamics. The designers weren't just building a plane. They were attempting to defy nature itself, to soar above the limits of human experience. It's a reminder that innovation often comes from desperation, and that sometimes the most extraordinary ideas emerge when the world is at its darkest. The story of the DFS 228 also highlights the risks of experimentation. The combination of wood, rocket fuel, and high-altitude flight was lethal in the wrong hands. Pilots needed nerves of steel, engineers needed precision, and luck needed to be abundant. In the end, it was luck and timing that denied the DFS 228 its place in combat history, a marvel that survived long enough to inspire, but never long enough to conquer. Even though the DFS 228 never saw combat, its influence quietly echoed through aviation history. Post-war engineers studied the surviving prototypes, fascinated by the combination of glider aerodynamics and rocket propulsion. Concepts like pressurized cockpits, detachable escape capsules, and lightweight high-altitude designs would resurface in Cold War reconnaissance aircraft. And even in early space exploration vehicles, some of the ideas pioneered by the DFS 228 found their way into the American X-15 program and the Soviet high-altitude research planes of the 1950s. Its brief existence showed that with clever engineering, humans could survive and maneuver in the upper layers of the atmosphere. It also became a cautionary tale, a warning about the limits of material science and the risks of pushing technology too far, too fast and under wartime pressure. Yet, for those who study aviation history closely, the DFS 228 remains magical. It embodies the elegance of gliding, the daring of rocket propulsion, and the audacity of imagining something that almost no one else thought possible at the time. Its wooden frame may have crumbled, But the dream it represented continues to inspire pilots, engineers, and aviation enthusiasts around the world. Despite its brilliance, the DFS 228 ultimately failed, and not because of poor design, but because of a perfect storm of circumstances. First, the choice of materials, while clever, proved dangerous. Wood was light and flexible, but in extreme cold and under rocket-powered stress, it could warp or crack. Glue and sealants of the era were inadequate for repeated high-altitude cycles, making long-term reliability impossible. Second, the timing was catastrophic. Germany was collapsing, factories were destroyed, supply lines disrupted, and skilled labor drafted into the front. The DFS 228 simply did not receive the attention, resources, or testing time it needed to mature into an operational aircraft. One successful prototype could not overcome the logistical nightmare surrounding it. Third, the operational concept itself was flawed. Launching a fragile wooden rocket-powered glider into enemy airspace required precise timing, favorable weather, and near-perfect pilot skill. Any minor failure in propulsion, pressurization, or structural integrity would be fatal, and there was no margin for error. The aircraft was, in many ways, a daring experiment, not a practical weapon. In the end, the DFS 228 was too ambitious for its era, a brilliant idea that collided with harsh reality. Its failure was not a lack of ingenuity, but a combination of war, materials, and human limitations. Today, the DFS 228 is largely forgotten outside of aviation history circles, yet it remains one of the most intriguing what-if aircraft of World War II. Books, museum exhibits, and rare photographs keep its memory alive, highlighting a machine that was part glider, part rocket, and entirely daring. Enthusiasts marvel at its sleek wooden lines and futuristic cockpit, imagining the silent glide over Europe's skies that almost happened. Its story is often romanticized, portrayed as a testament to human ambition and ingenuity in the face of desperation. Modelers recreate it in miniature. Documentaries explore its strange, almost science fiction-like design, and aviation historians study its blueprints to understand how Germany pushed the limits of material science and aerodynamics. Even though it failed operationally, its conceptual success, proving humans could survive and maneuver in the upper atmosphere, casts a lasting shadow. The DFS 228 also serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that wartime pressure can drive astonishing innovation, but without adequate resources, testing, and timing, even the most brilliant concepts can collapse. For anyone fascinated by the extremes of aviation, the DFS 228 is a symbol of dreams that soared briefly, only to vanish into history. The story of the DFS 228 teaches us more than just technical lessons. It's a study in ambition, risk, and timing. From an engineering perspective, it shows the incredible potential of lightweight materials, aerodynamics, and hybrid propulsion systems, concepts that would later shape both high-altitude aircraft and early spacecraft. The pressurized cockpit and detachable nose capsule, for instance, foreshadowed ejection systems and crew survival modules used decades later. But it also highlights the dangers of overreaching. No matter how brilliant the design, human and material limitations impose strict boundaries. The combination of wood, rocket fuel, and extreme altitude was an inherently risky experiment. Only a perfect environment, abundant resources, and flawless execution could have transformed the DFS 228 from a prototype into a successful reconnaissance aircraft. On a broader level, the DFS 228 reminds us that innovation often comes in the shadow of necessity and desperation. Engineers worked against impossible odds, and while the plane failed operationally, its legacy influenced generations of aircraft designers. It's a story of vision, courage, and the fragile line between genius and folly. A wooden rocket that almost reached the heavens, but landed in history instead. So here we are, At the end of the incredible story of the DFS 228, Germany's wooden rocket plane that almost touched the stratosphere but ultimately failed. From its delicate wooden frame to the daring pilot in a pressurized capsule, it was an aircraft born from imagination, desperation, and genius. Even though it never flew a combat mission, its influence rippled through aviation history, inspiring future high-altitude research planes and early spacecraft concepts. The DFS 228 reminds us that innovation often comes at the edge of risk, where brilliance meets danger, and where dreams sometimes outpace reality. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of World War II's most fascinating aviation experiments, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Pilots, hit that notification bell, and share this video with fellow aviation enthusiasts. And don't miss our next video, where we shift from the skies to the land, an incredible exploration of life on the farm and the rugged challenges of ranching. Trust me, it's going to be just as fascinating as our journey through the clouds. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies, your curiosity alive, and your passion for history burning bright.